So let's single subject rule in the initiative, which is better known to most, but there's also the single subject rule that applies to legislation as well. In California's Constitution, Article 2, Section 8D, it provides that an initiative measure embracing more than one subject may not be submitted to the electors or have any effect. You may recall that a similar rule exists for bills considered by the California legislature, and frankly, the courts have interpreted the rules in a similar manner. You'll note in the language in Section 8D that it says may not be submitted or have any effect. That means that there can be a pre-election challenge or a post-election challenge, whether an initiative has violated the single subject Constitution. The general idea behind the single subject rule is to try and ensure that ballot measures are not overly complex, that they don't possibly confuse voters, or worse, hide provisions and maybe a multi-part measure. Some have argued that the single subject rule also precludes combining popular and unpopular but unrelated provisions in one big omnibus measure in order to increase its chances of success. Now, based upon the language that's contained again in Article 2, Section 8D, if an initiative embraces, that's the key word, embraces more than one subject, then it can't be submitted to the voters or enacted by the voters. So again, this means that there are two opportunities to challenge the initiative measure based upon the single subject rule. In other words, there can be a pre-election challenge to it or a post-election challenge on this single subject rule violation ground, or at least an allegation of a violation. The obvious question that's posed by the language of the Constitution here is, what does embracing mean and how is the word subject defined? We have to turn to some court decisions to understand how these terms are defined by the judicial branch of California so that we have some guidance in understanding the language of Section 8D. So here are two. The first is Raven versus Deukmejian, a 1990 California Supreme Court decision. And there the court said, an initiative measure does not violate the single subject requirement if, despite its varied collateral effects, all of its parts are reasonably germane to each other and to the general purpose or object of the initiative. The single subject rule does not require functional interrelationship or interdependence of provisions, or a showing that each one of the measure's several provisions was capable of getting voter approval independently of the other provisions. The other famous court decision is Amador Valley Joint Union High School District versus the State Board of Equalization, which was a 1978 California Supreme Court decision. And there the court said that minimization of the risk of voter confusion and deception was one of the purposes of the single subject requirement of California Constitution's Article 2, Section 8D. They also said, the High Court said that an initiative measure will not violate the single subject requirement if, despite its varied collateral effect, all of its parts are reasonably germane to each other. So the basic guidance that we've gotten from the courts is whether the provisions of the initiative are reasonably germane, or later court decisions say reasonably related to each other, which obviously is a pretty broad test. We know that the word germane is defined generally as being relevant to the particular subject matter, but this again is a pretty broad definition to utilize to determine whether or not the main topic or topics of the initiative are reasonably related to one another.